Good afternoon, brothers and sisters. We are now on the Lunch and Learn series number 33, and our topic is Mary, Role Model for the Interior Life, Reflection, Meditation, and Contemplation. Our guest speaker for this afternoon is Sister Malen Hava. She's the novice directress of the Religious of the Cenacle in Asia. She's been with the Cenacle for the last 35 years, giving retreats, counseling, and spiritual direction. She was previously a teacher in St. Teresa's Cebu. Let's now welcome Sister Malen Hava.
Thank you. And welcome to those of you who have been faithful. I was told that there's a faithful flock here who come to this series. When I was invited to, when I got the invitation for this afternoon's talk, I said to myself, it's very appropriate that I speak about Mary. And I'd like to, this is going to be the theme of my talk. Mary pondered all these in her heart. Mary, Our Lady of the Cenacle. I'd like to introduce that particular title of Mary. That's where we get our inspiration of our life. So this is a holy card that we're very familiar with in the Cenacle. And it shows Mary in prayer. And at her back are all the names of the disciples, of the apostles. And then you have the Holy Spirit on her. So I'd like to begin this talk with a song. And it is a song to Mary, the Memorare.
Inspired by this confidence, I fly unto you, O Virgin of Virgins, my Mother. To you I come, before you I stand, sinful and sorrowful. Despise not my petition, but in your mercy, hear and answer me. Hear and answer.
The days between the Feast of the Ascension and Pentecost, which is what we're experiencing this week, is very special to us Cenacle sisters. This Saturday, we celebrate our titular feast, the feast of our congregation. And we celebrate the feast of Our Lady of the Retreat in the Cenacle. That's our official name. Most of us, in preparation for this feast, go on a 3-day retreat or a triduum in preparation for our renewal of vows. It's a devotional renewal of vows that we do on our feast. The word cenacle really comes from the Latin word cenaculum, which is the upper room. And if we jog our memories a little bit about the life of Jesus, this was a special time where he gathered his disciples and had the Last Supper, a celebration of life and friendship. It is also the place in scriptures where the disciples would go back after the ascension. So when the disciples witnessed the ascension of the risen Jesus going to heaven, we read in Acts 1:13-14. When they entered the city, they went to the upper room where they were staying. Peter and John, James and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James son of Alphaeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas son of James. All these devoted themselves with one accord to prayer, together with some women, and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and his brothers. It's very interesting that all the men are named, and then by way of addition, oh, by the way, there were some women too who were praying with them. And, of course, Mary, the mother of Jesus. Whenever a woman is named in scriptures, that means she's really very important. There's a very significant role that she plays. All these men and women disciples of the risen Jesus devoted themselves with one accord, they were in one mind and one heart, with Mary, the mother of Jesus, in prayer, not knowing what would happen next. We, who have lived after scriptures were written, we know that the Pentecost or the coming of the Spirit would happen, but they did not. Like, so what's next? I guess it's very much like how we're feeling after the elections. What's next? Maybe we should go to the cenacle and pray with Mary. Remember, they did not know what it was going to be about. And they just felt they needed to be together. Looking at Mary, sometimes I ask, I was trying to look for images of Mary, and it was always with the baby Jesus. It's always Madonna and child. And whenever I hear people speak about their devotion to Mary, it's always Mama Mary. It's almost like we cannot separate Mary from her motherhood. So is that motherhood the special significance, the only thing that we look to Mary for? No doubt, this is her special and unique role. It's a very privileged role. I mean, nobody else will be the biological mother of Jesus. No, she's the only one. So it's a special role. And but I think we can easily exclude what the church also teaches us as having a great and important significance about Mary. Mary is also the first Christian disciple and the prime believer of the risen Christ. This is the image of Mary that the Gospel of St. Luke tries to paint. Tradition says St. Luke was supposed to have interviewed Mary to write his gospel. And that's why he's often portrayed as painting. We don't really know if it's true. It's a nice story. What we do know about St. Luke is he must have been some kind of healer, because there's a lot of healing stories in his gospel. I would like to do some reflection on the role of Mary in the Gospel of Luke and also the beginning part of the Acts of the Apostles, which Luke was supposed to have written also. But first, I would like to put a contextual note regarding the audience for whom St. Luke wrote his gospel. They were well-to-do Christian citizens of the Roman Empire who lived in the cities. They were called the Gentile Christians, the non-Jews. They were well-to-do. They were not illiterate. They were not poor. Not like the original disciples of Jesus. And they were already far removed from the Jewish roots of Christianity. So St. Luke, being a Gentile himself, was challenged to make Jesus' words, which was originally spoken to a Hebrew audience half a century earlier. So can you just imagine? Jesus spoke to a particular group of people 50 years before, and the message continues. And St. Luke wanted this same message to be heard and appropriated by modern Greeks. He wanted his hearers to know that they too were included in God's plan of salvation from the beginning. That's why it's very important in the Gospel of Luke, there is that story of the three magi. Remember? What we call the three kings, who came from the east. This is symbolic of all the people who did not belong to the Jewish faith, that they were also called to believe in Jesus. So even if the Jews were the first ones to hear it, the non-Jews or the Gentiles were part of the salvation of God. Therefore, we can say that the Gospel of St. Luke tells the story of the origin of Christianity, starting from the first annunciation of the births of John the Baptist and of Jesus, to the fulfillment of salvation until its completion in the death and resurrection of Jesus. Interestingly enough, we see that in the Gospel of Luke, we have what is called the infancy narratives. The story about the baby Jesus. And Mary here plays a very significant role. In the Gospel of Matthew, it's Joseph who plays a significant role in his infancy narrative. So when we talk about the infancy narratives, this begins from the annunciation of the angel of the birth of Jesus, all the way to finding the boy Jesus, who was 12 years old, in the temple. So there were many strange events that happened to Mary in connection with Jesus. In the infancy narratives, Mary is portrayed as one with a struggling human faith. So remember in the Annunciation, so she was told, you're going to be the mother of God. And she questions the angel, says, how can that be? Okay? Even so, when she had her questions, she makes an assertion of faith despite her lack of understanding. And this is what we call her fiat, let it be done unto me. And a proclamation of the fulfillment of God's promises. This we see later on in her Magnificat. It is interesting that in the second chapter of St. Luke, there is this curious statement that is mentioned twice. Mary treasured all these things and pondered them in her heart. The first time, in the second chapter of Luke, verse 19, after the visit of the shepherds, and they told Mary and Joseph, we saw these angels, and they told us this. That's why we came. Can you imagine the surprise? What are you talking about? But they were gracious and received, and Mary treasured and pondered these things in her heart. Strange visions, strange words about the newborn baby. The second time this idea comes, it's again in the gospel, in the second chapter of Luke, verse 51. This is after the finding of the boy Jesus in the temple. So you remember at 12, now, even that detail, he was 12 years old. In the Jewish faith, when a young boy reaches 12, they have what is called a bar mitzvah. It's like a rite of passage. This is where, okay, now we will test whether this boy knows his faith, his scriptures. A very important role of the father in the Jewish family is to teach the boy scriptures, to memorize and to explain. So, if we see Jesus as an adult, quoting scriptures left and right, and having such depth of explanation, we can attribute that to Joseph. Joseph was the first catechist of the human Jesus. That was part of the family system. What about Mary? She was the soul. In the Jewish family, it was the mother who led the Sabbath prayers. So it was the mother who told the stories. It was the mother who taught the prayers. But it was you can say, it was the father who was the theology professor. And the mother was the religion teacher. Something like that. So, we see there, usually the bar mitzvah happens in the temple. Okay? And there's only one temple. It's the temple in Jerusalem. That's why they always go there for the Feast of the Passover. And so we know the story, Jesus gets lost, or they thought he was lost. And they were looking, they were so upset. And then Mary, finding Jesus, says, "Don't you realize the worry that it has caused us?" Imagine yourself losing your son. And the strange answer was, "Why are you looking for me? I'm supposed to be here, in my father's business, in my father's house." How do you think Joseph felt? To be told this, in my father's house. And Joseph knows that that's not his biological son. It's like, this is really a coming of age. Something is going to be very different. And yet, it says in that verse, he went down with them and came to Nazareth and lived under their authority. His mother stored all these things in her heart. Pondering in the heart. Sometimes, because of our contemporary understanding or experience of heart, Cupid, Valentine's Day, heartache, love life, we sort of narrow down heart to just feelings. But in scriptures, heart is not only the seat of emotions. It is considered the seat of thoughts and wisdom. And so it will also include emotions, but it's not only emotions. The heart is the core, or the innermost part of the person, the center of one's personality, where the person is totally honest and open before God. Therefore, we say, the heart is the place of prayer. In the book of Ecclesiasticus, or sometimes in some Bibles, it's called the book of Sirach, the 17th chapter is a retelling of the creation story of the human person by Yahweh. And it's very interesting. It says there, the Lord Yahweh created the human, gave them eyes and ears, and a mouth, and things like that. And the Lord gave the human a heart to think with. A heart to think with. When I first read that, many years ago as a novice, I said, a heart to think with? How can you think with your heart? And yet, I needed to go into the biblical roots of the heart is not just emotions, it is the seat of thoughts and wisdom. Ponder, pondering. To ponder means to think about or consider something carefully. It's almost like discerning, discernment. It includes prolonged, inconclusive thinking. I think about it, and still don't get the point, And all these happens in the person's heart. These two passages from St. Luke's 2nd chapter show Mary at prayer or dialoguing with God in her heart. regarding experiences she struggled to understand and yet chose to believe. What things was she talking to God about? In the infancy narratives, we have very human experiences of Mary confronted with an overwhelming mystery that made her spontaneously ask God, okay, what's this all about? Not because she lacked faith, but because her limited humanity could not comprehend that God's plan included her. Me? You sure? What's this all about? Okay. And then the angel says, you're going to be the mother. Huh? It's like, and then the question of Mary was, how can this be since I don't know any man? That is supposed to be read, how can I get pregnant when I haven't had sex with anyone? That's what it meant. Not know as in getting to know you. No, know in the gospel means really thorough knowing of the other, and including the sexual and physical. Wasn't it logical for Mary to ask these questions? I mean, she was thinking. She wasn't just a dumb blonde, as they would say. She was thinking. When the angel gave her an answer that must have sounded more cryptic about, you'll be overshadowed by the Holy Spirit. What's that? I mean, like, remember Mary at this time is a peasant woman, peasant girl. She was supposed to have been 15. And all she knew was really toil, hard work, and great faith. Whatever it meant, or whatever she understood of it, she assented. I am the handmaid of the Lord. Be it done unto me. Little did she realize that this was just going to be the beginning of many more obscure events that would test her faith and her fiat. Yet Mary, being a devout and good Jewish believer, was deeply rooted in the faith traditions of her people, especially in the belief that God had intervened in many times in their history. God saved His people. And what seemed impossible was made possible in God. After the infancy narratives, Luke is silent about Mary until the incident in Luke 8, chapter 8, where she and other relatives went to see if they could talk to Jesus, but because he was so popular at this time, they could not get near him at all. Unlike the other evangelists, Luke does not mention Mary being at the foot of the cross with the other women. And it is only again in Acts 1, verse 14, what I had read earlier, that Mary is mentioned again by name. This painting was commissioned by our French sisters. And this was done by one of the more famous French painters, Arcabas. And I had the privilege of being in the Cenacle in France when this painting was brought in, and Mr. Arcabas was there. So I asked him, can you explain your painting to me? I know it must have sounded stupid, but never mind. I would risk being stupid before this great man. He's a very famous old artist somewhere in southern France. And I said, oh, I'm very happy you have women in your painting. And you have all kinds of colors, in terms of races. He says, but that's the church. What will the church be without women? What will the church be without all the races? Yeah, that's true. And Mr. Arcabas is not a practicing Catholic. He's a very good man. And I said, why is there a book? You notice there's a book. And if you look at the different paintings of Mary, especially the medieval paintings, she's either reading a book or there's an open book beside her. She says, that's the scriptures. That's an artistic symbol or something about being in communion with Jesus the Word. So even as they were praying, the Word was with them. I said, okay. And I said, so where's the Spirit? He says, it's there, all the red things there. Okay. And I said, how come there's gray there? Oh, remember in Pentecost, there was the deafening sound like thunder when the Spirit comes. So that's how he put it there. And they were all in prayer. So this passage in Acts 1, verse 14, shows the disciples who, after witnessing the ascension, went to the upper room and gathered around Mary in prayer. Put yourself in the place of the disciples. Probably they were so confused. What's all this? He suffered. He was very popular. He suffered, and then he died, and then he became alive again. And then, he did all these wonderful things. And now he's gone. So, where does that leave us? Very confusing. Overwhelmed with all kinds of emotions with all that happened. So they probably look at each other and said, oh, you betrayed him, You that kind of drama that you aren't as good as you think you are. They're very human. This was before the coming of the Spirit. They needed a steady anchor to reorient themselves, and that was where Mary comes in. What things could Mary have possibly treasured and pondered in her heart this time? This small and vulnerable group of Jesus' disciples who gathered around her had witnessed Jesus' suffering, death, resurrection, and now his ascension. They could not understand what it all meant and what it would ask from them. And Jesus was no longer there to explain things. They just had each other, which was not probably much of a consolation at that time. When the disciples went back to the upper room of the Last Supper, they must have remembered things that Jesus said to them, which they did not yet understand either. And yet, his words held such power and comfort. In the upper room, they found Mary, his mother, who unconditionally accepted these friends and disciples of her son. No recriminations, no blaming, no laying of guilt trips, no silence that drips with sarcasm. Nothing of that. Just loving, accepting presence. As Mary prayed in the cenacle, she must have recalled all the varied events of her life and her son's life, memories that she treasured and often reflected upon in her heart, the many events connected with her son's life and vocation, which she did not really understand. She knew that there was something special about her son. Like they say, a mother would always know, you would always know, the mother would always know that the child is hers because she gives birth to the child. But the father trusts in faith that that's his child. That's what they say. So Mary knew that there was something very strange about this son. It was not conceived in the usual way. And then all these events happened. It's like, what kind of child is this? And yet there was that love and acceptance. So many times probably when Jesus was doing things and growing up, Mary would look at him and would say, what child is this? This is my son. But I wonder what will happen to him. That whole questioning. There was a lot of misunderstanding, unclarity, obscurity. And yet Mary did not say to God, explain to me, what is this all about? It was just pondering. Mary remembered all these things, and now, in the cenacle, she's beginning to see the meaning of her son's life and vocation. Why he had to suffer and die the way he did. His resurrection, and now he's ascending back to his Father. It were as though the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle have come together. It's like the experience of connecting the dots. So that's what it's all about. Mary in the cenacle is not a young Mary. She's an older woman. Maybe like us, most of us here. When you think of yourself, when you were 15, we were probably so naive and so hopeful about life. And when the things that have happened to our life have happened, it can either make us cynical, been there, done that, what good is that? You know, the kind of thing. Or we learn, we become realistic. Mary in the cenacle is a woman who has weathered through the uncertainties and obscurities of her life experiences. Now she looks back at her own life without any regret or despair, but with gratitude and peace. She is one who willingly shares her memories of her son to encourage his friends to also remember their experiences with him. For is this not what we do in prayer? To remember or to bring to our present situation the reality of our relationship with Jesus. And this was the special gift she gave the young and fragile church. Mary, like any mother, is the glue. Yes, for those of you who have lost mothers, things change in the family, don't they? It's like the center is lost because you have to create other centers. And yet, in the beginning, it's very disturbing. That's part of the transition. And this is a transitional occasion, this time in the cenacle, that they were lost, they were confused, they just needed some kind of reference point, and Mary was there. She was the steadying force. Looking at Mary in prayer, we ask ourselves, what qualities of prayer can she teach us from her experience of pondering and treasuring all these things in her heart? We recall that prayer is an ongoing relationship or dialogue with God, and it requires from us attentiveness. Attentiveness implies listening with alertness to the familiarity one shares with God. Because of this familiarity with God, Mary is enabled to question and to express freely the unclarity in her mind and heart. This questioning is a sign of an awakened faith, a faith based on her own experiences of the reality of God in her life, and not just relying on what others have taught her. This attentiveness is also a capacity to notice, to become sensitive to others' needs and to the extraordinary in the ordinary. This is what people say, to see reality with the eyes of faith. You see something beyond what is obvious. Mary remembered and treasured all that happened to her and talked to God about these. After the angel told her about her cousin Elizabeth's pregnancy, Mary hastens to go to be with Elizabeth. This shows a vigilant attitude towards others, a clear-sightedness, a readiness to notice signs of suffering around, and a willingness to get involved. Do we grow in attentiveness as a result of our ongoing life of prayer? It's a good question to ponder on. The second quality of Mary's prayer is remembering. Whenever you have an image of Mary with her hands like that, this is what they call orantes, praying. So Mary at prayer. Remembering is an important feature in the faith life of a Jew and also of a Christian. In remembering, God's people bring to mind and to the active present all that God has done for them. Whatever suffering experienced in the present becomes more bearable by remembering God's saving acts in the past. And this is what we do, we try to do in the Eucharist. During the time of the memorial, do this in memory of me. It's not just a formula, but it's really an act of faith saying, Jesus is really there, and we're going through all this remembering. Remember that God never left us. Remember that God intervenes. And the Jews had a very long history of God's interventions. And we claim that part of the Jewish history in our own faith. Through remembering, there is an anticipation and expectation that God's saving actions will happen again and again and again. Mary in the cenacle remembered all the difficult and painful events connected with her son, which she could not understand at the time it happened. She returned to these over and over to let some meaning come to her. Because she had the courage to remember these obscure and painful events and words, her heart opened up to expect with joyful anticipation the saving power of God. So we ask ourselves, how have we used our capacity for remembering in prayer to bring to our present a sense of hope? When we are in the midst of great trial, do we remember how God has been gracious? Or do we say, oh, God has left me, God has abandoned me? We go into that spin of, poor me, I'm abandoned, I'm helpless. We don't remember the good things God has done for us. Comparing Mary in the infancy narratives of Luke's Gospel with her human faith struggling to understand, yet moving towards acceptance, and Mary in the cenacle, where we see a fullness and maturation of her faith, we can say that Mary's faith journey culminated through her integration or her disappearance into the community of those who believe in the risen Christ, the church. Because after Acts 1, verse 14, there is nothing mentioned about Mary anymore. They just become silent. So what happened to her? So there are many stories about her. But really, when you really reflect and pray about it, she just immersed herself in the life of the church, not calling attention to herself. That's why one of the beautiful titles of Mary is, we have a parish in Quezon City, Madonna de la Strada, Our Lady of the Way. The way to what? The way to Jesus. Mary will never want that she becomes the focus. Come to me, I'll bring you to my son. That's always a theologically sound devotion to Mary. Because if you stop at Mary, there might be competition. She's Our Lady of the Way, always pointing to Jesus. That's why Scripture also puts that very clearly by being quiet about her. Even if she was the first to accept and to believe that Jesus, whom she conceived, would have a special role in the lives of people, Mary had to choose continuously to believe, even when she did not understand. Many times, this must have brought her into great darkness and confusion and unclarity. Yet, she believed in God's promises because God is faithful. Mary in the cenacle has gone through a lot that the attentiveness she had made her discern God's presence in the seeming absence. She grew ever more in trust and surrender to this mysterious yet loving God. Mary in these two events, the infancy narratives and Mary in the cenacle, act like bookends to the story of the origin and growth of Christianity. These two events show how Mary ushered two important beginnings or birthings in the life of the church, both through the action of the Holy Spirit. And that's why she's always identified as mother. The first birthing is in Luke 2, the beginning of a new dispensation through the birth of Jesus. Hence, she is rightly called Mother of Jesus. The second birthing is the beginning of a new community of faith through the birth of the church at Pentecost. And therefore, she is also called the Mother of the Church. We had one reflection done by this very revered theologian, and he speaks about Mary as the memory of the church. The memory of Jesus in the church. I think it's a beautiful image, no? Like there will be people in our families. If you want the latest story, I will go to this person. Oh, what's happening to the family? Why so and so, so and so and so. And they're the ones who can trace. They're the historians, of the family. Maybe you're that. That is a very special role to be the memory of your family. And this was Mary. She was the memory about Jesus for the church. After this mention of Mary in Acts 1, she fades in the background. What we have now is a woman who has finally come to her own. One who has found peace and joy in the fulfillment of her role, ushering new beginnings and then fading away. A woman who perhaps remained active in the church without drawing attention to herself, but instead found peace and happiness in the attention given to this new community of believers. And so maybe during this time, we can really pray to Mary and ask her particular intercession to help us remember Jesus, to help us be more attentive to our lives and to the needs around us and what God might be asking us to do. So I'd like to close this reflection again with the same picture that I began and her song, the Magnificat.
All that I am sings of the God who brings new life to birth in me. My spirit soars on the wings of my Lord. All that I am sings of the God who brings new life to birth in me. My spirit soars on the wings of my
My soul gives
Lord.
glory to the Lord, rejoicing in my saving God.
Looks upon me in my state, and all the world will call me
For God works
blessed.
marvels in my sight,
And holy, holy is God's name. All that I am sings of the God who brings new life to birth in me. My spirit soars
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sister Malen, for the very profound reflection and messages and inspirations you've given this afternoon on the role of Mary in our lives as gleaned from the Holy Scriptures. Is there any question for Sister Malen? Okay, since there's none, we'd like to announce that the next Lunch and Learn series will be on June 3, entitled Music and Spirituality, featuring Kerigma preacher Alvin Barcelona, a singer, songwriter, and radio television host. Thank you. Okay, thank you.